closing plenary session. We are down to the hardcore. Congratulations on a conference well spent. And I think you'll find this session a wonderful capstone experience. Since our speakers need no introduction, I thought I'd take a little time to introduce myself to you. But unfortunately, time doesn't permit anything more than my name and rank. I'm Richard Kudo. I'm a senior scholar at the University of the Union Institute, and I find myself evolving from senior scholar status to a scholarly senior. On very short notice, Alexander and Ron agreed to move their presentation this afternoon to a plenary, and we are in a pretty severe time constraint, and that Ron has to be wheels rolling by 3:45 to catch his car to the airport. He's on his way to Greece to spend some time with a former student, the president. Wouldn't you like to be able to drop that, in conversation? Oh, yes, I'm one of my former students, the president of Greece. So we're going to turn the session over to them, but please do not think us rude if we have to cut the session precisely at 3:40 or 3:45. We are working within a time constraint. And if you notice the schedule, Ron has been on 3 sessions since about this time yesterday, so this is really extraordinary and heroic. We've seen him do these things on short notice before. We've added sleep deprivation to this presentation, and we were negotiating to doing it blindfolded, but we decided that would probably be a little bit too much. Both Ron and Alexander will be speaking on their new book, and this is the plug, The Practice of Adaptive Leadership. Alexander Grashoff is one of the co-authors of the book. He is CEO and has been for 7 years of the Cambridge Leadership Associates. He is the practice side of the academics. His background is as a economics and fine arts major at Wesleyan College in Connecticut. And that combination of minors prepared him, his occasional tuned parents thought, for painting banking murals. But fortunately, he's combined the left and right brain a little bit differently, working in both Southern Africa and Southeast Asia in economic development, and being one of the co-founders for Synergos of Bridging Leadership with Peggy Delaney. Ron Heifetz, I won't go into his many accomplishments. You know them. Let me just say that he's an exemplar of interdisciplinary scholarship. He gives our field a very good name in that people come to leadership literature beyond the airport racks and ask themselves, what can I use from this field? And they find things like adaptive work, holding environments, getting on the balcony, giving work back to others, and the distinction leadership with and without authority, all of which are keys to the scholarship that you all are conducting at this time. He is a synergistic, integrative scholar, and he is also a person who contributes from leadership to other fields as well. In co-authorship with their partner, Marty Linsky, they have written The Practice of Adaptive Leadership. They're going to be talking about that book. If time permits, we will take questions and answers, at least questions. You might provide your own answers, which is the best of the adaptive challenge that we're all facing. So without further ado, Alexandra and Ron.
I'm going to. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. Several of you were in the various sessions that I did earlier today and yesterday, and it's just a delight to get to be with colleagues. This is a unique opportunity for me nearly each year to get to be part of this association. So. In the short time that we have, we want to share with you some ideas about ways to approach crisis, which grow out of a variety of pieces of work of ours, many of which are elaborated in this new book. That we live particularly dramatically right now, a little more than a year into this economic crisis, in a time of ongoing instability is not a new thing to say. It's an obvious thing that we all are living with. And in many of our countries, the unemployment rate and the various kinds of dislocation are becoming ever more palpable to many of us. So I want to present a few ideas in regard to the first phase of crisis leadership, and then I'm going to turn it over to Alexander and let him talk to the more significant second phase of crisis leadership. But first, to the nature of crisis itself. Crisis can be understood to have these three basic characteristics: high stakes, high uncertainty, and time pressure. People feel a sense of urgency that something has to happen now because there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of difficulty, and the stakes are high. Because of that time pressure, there's enormous high set of expectations on people in authority to restore order quickly. And in a sense, crisis leadership could then be understood to have two basic phases: an emergency phase and an adaptive phase. And it's useful to distinguish these phases because the emergency phase, I started off in medicine, so I worked and ran emergency rooms for a short period of time early in my career. The emergency phase is really its own area of study and significantly important, because if you don't treat the emergency properly, if you don't stabilize the organization or stabilize the political situation, or in medicine stabilize the patient, you don't get to do the rest of the work. You generate a catastrophe, and then you fall behind several steps in any process as you just try to bring yourself back into a state of sufficient repair to do the next phase of work. So I want to speak a little bit about that emergency phase, which again has these two basic goals: stabilizing the situation and buying time. Now, unfortunately, sometimes people are so good at restoring order, restoring equilibrium in the emergency phase, that the problem itself goes off people's radar screen. People go back into complacency because we've sort of done such a good job at damage control or stabilization. And the challenge really in the emergency phase is to buy time, but not buy time so you can go back to sleep, but buy time so that you can then do the real work of addressing the underlying causes of the situation. So, to the challenge of the emergency itself. Those of us who lived through 9/11 in the United States, and all of those who sort of felt it at a distance from abroad, I think will relate to the dramatic moment that provides as an illustration, as sort of an extreme illustration of the emergency phase, where the central tasks for people in authority, first of all, is to be present. On most days in the United States, people can get through a whole day without seeing the face of the President of the United States. During the last administration, some of us could even get through a week. But on September 11th, 2001, there was an extraordinary regression to a fundamental default setting A basic default setting that emerges from the time we're born, helplessly scanning the horizon for somebody in authority who can provide us with direction for food, protection from danger, and order to our lives. And that inclination to look to authorities in times of distress gets reinforced countless times, so that by the time we're 20 years old, we've all had innumerable experiences in times of trouble, turning to our elders for relief. And that is a frequently enormously useful response. Because of that response, people in authority, simply by showing up, will calm people down. People feel calmed just to know that you are there. And when Rudolph Giuliani spent a lot of time on the street being physically present, it made a big difference to people in preventing panic and reducing the level of disequilibrium. And when the President of the United States was in hiding most of the day until dinner time, people were upset in the United States because they wanted to see their president. And where was he? And he took a fair amount of political heat because he was doing, indeed, what was the smart and reasonable thing to do, which was to protect himself and his office from danger. However, in the short term, we can see the inclination of human beings, all of us, even grown-up, mature people, to fall back to a state of dependency in a time of distress. And that means that in the authority position, when you are present and when you then speak to people's experience, it calms people down and it buys time. It buys time to be able to say to people, I understand something about what you're going through. And again, Giuliani, who's not a particularly eloquent man, spoke in plain and eloquently simple terms that made people in New York City really have a sense that he knew what was happening, that he felt their pain, to use a Clinton-esque phrase. Moreover, people read the person in authority for clues. Is this a containable situation, or should we panic? And if the authority figure looks like they are panicking, if he or she looks like they are overwhelmed, then it communicates to the public or to the business organization that this is an uncontainable situation. So it's critically important that the person in authority, even if they feel like jello inside, even if they feel overwhelmingly anxious inside, can fake it long enough. And I know none of us like the idea that one has to at times fake it. But it won't be helpful to people if you start simply expressing everything you feel inside when the person in front of you depends on you to give them confidence that we can make it through these times. And so that capacity to deploy oneself with more confidence, in fact, than you might feel, with poise, is critically important in regulating the level of panic and disturbance so that people stay in the game. Fourth is the obvious one. In an emergency, you don't have time to create new procedures. So at best, you've already prepared a set of contingency plans so that you have organizations in place ready to mobilize quickly to alleviate at least the immediate consequences of the emergency. Just like in an emergency room in a hospital, doctors are geared to handling what comes through the door. And the role of authority then is to drive that prepared organizational response. Interestingly enough, the activism itself, the sense of that somebody's at the helm driving with command and control the organizational response, calms people down too. And finally, emergencies are so tightly constrained in terms of time that you don't have much room to improvise. Still, you have to improvise to some degree, whatever extent is possible, to meet the crisis, because the emergency usually doesn't come straight out of a can just as you had anticipated. And that capacity for improvisational flexibility, like our pianist beforehand, who plays so lovely, is critically important. But it's also important to know that you don't have room to address the underlying work. At best, you have time to begin to position people to look forward to the kind of work that will be required once you make it through the emergency phase. And so I'd like to turn it over now to Alexander to look at what it takes to work the adaptive phase of a crisis.
Thank you, Ron. There's great human hope that the crisis will be over quickly. And we have to have compassion for that hope and the belief and the desire for the transition, if it's going to be difficult, will be over soon. The challenge is for a leadership community when we know that road will be bumpy and last a lot longer than people want. So the question is, what is the set of skills to help people through that longer road? And that's what we want to begin to think about, is this question of how do you prepare people for that ongoing road of disequilibrium. In our work with clients in the public sector and the private sector and nonprofit, there's a shared understanding that we're getting that some prosperity may come back, but stability is not going to come back. The interdependence and growing interdependence of our organizations and the uncontrollable issues that keep coming up and the lack of one party that can solve them is adding to this ongoing challenge. The same idea is true given the complexity of the number of adaptive challenges we face. And the idea that we're going to work our tails off fixing that first one. And then there's another one right behind it. There's another thunderstorm coming. And so what we're trying to understand is how do we hold people through that process and understand that disequilibrium. Our experience is that there's a level of disequilibrium that gets too hot. That at some level the fight, flight, or freeze, the reptilian brain takes over and things blow up. People turn off, people walk out of the room, or they just stop listening in all kinds of forms. And so we want to think about that upper limit of tolerance. But from our experience, there's also a threshold when we need some heat to actually get change to occur. And below that threshold, it's just status quo. We might think about doing something, we're not actually going to do anything about it. And so what that creates is what we would think of as a productive zone of disequilibrium. How do you put enough heat into the situation to get people's attention, to deal with the tough issues, to engage people in those trade-offs between their values and the values of the other people, and not have it get too hot so that the whole thing blows up. So all of us in this room have their hands on the thermostat and trying to think of how do we engage people in this work. The challenge is that when you go into this zone, it's where the conflict is and surfaces the conflict. And so before you ever get there, if I'm trying to take Ron there in a difficult conversation, before we ever get to that blue line, he's going to say, ooh, it's too hot. So how do you explore and dance into that space and hold people there is a critical piece that we want to think about as our skill set as a community and as individuals in our organizations. The challenge is also amplified. If you look at the green line here, which is what we think of as the footprint of a technical challenge, that there's a high level of disequilibrium. You put the old fix on it, maybe there's a little bump in the road, but it can get solved in a shorter time. The technical work is really satisfying. I love knocking things off my to-do list. Right? This is a group of people who are problem solvers. Right? We love doing that kind of stuff. But what we see is adaptive work takes a lot more time, and it's a much more difficult road. And so one of the questions is how are we preparing ourselves and the organizations, the institutions, our students for that footprint that's going to get too hot at times because we need to go there to discover the upper boundary. They're going to drift below because people are going to try and find all ways to get out of those difficult conversations. And so the question is, what's the skill set to hold people through that space? The red line here is work avoidance. One of the things we track in organizations and work with them are all the ways that people get out of the heat, forming a subcommittee that has no authority. All right? I'm a New Yorker, so I make a sarcastic joke. Right? But we all have our ways to get out of that zone. And what we call work avoidance happens both personally, when we're with a client or a student, and there's a tough issue that's going to raise the heat and cause something in our stomachs to know, and the way organizations do it. So how do you track and understand your own work avoidance and that of the communities you work with? Next idea. Part of why we use the metaphor of adaptation is to try and understand what's the road or the work ahead of us. The first challenge, represented by this first circle, is trying to determine the essential DNA from the expendable DNA. The good news in our experience is that most of this work is conservative. That most change work don't change everything. A lot of the work is trying to understand what's the best of our traditions, our histories, our ways of being in the world that we want to preserve and continue with us. And the beauty of finding that work, of what of my ancestors, of my grandparents that left Europe, am I trying to live out today? Or what of my organization that was solved with a mission in mind, or trying to create value for the customers? How do we understand what to hold on to? It's not easy to figure out what that other 20% is, because you're going to have to sift through all of that work to figure out what that piece is. And the other challenge is that, in our experience, people aren't afraid of change. People don't give back winning lotto tickets. People don't turn down pay raises. People are afraid of loss. They're afraid of giving up how they've learned to be effective in the world. And how everything that I've done to come today, it may not be sufficient for tomorrow, is a challenging idea. And so how do you hold people in that place to figure out what of who they are as an organization, as a student, as a company, are they going to let go of as the first piece of the work along this road? And this causes disequilibrium. Because to identify those two pieces is challenging, especially when different parties will think there's different things to give up. The second idea is, what are we going to fill it with? Where are we going to take the risks and experiment? This causes disequilibrium because there will be a high failure rate. Most of us don't have a high tolerance for failure, or the tolerance for failure that we need. Every organization has its folklore of what happens to those people who tried something and failed. One of the questions for us as a community is, how do we help organizations create new folklore about how to experiment and try new things? And then lastly, how do you bring this to scale? How do you change an organization to accept and embrace new DNA to be in the world? The last idea I just want to think about, is three ideas, is tuning the instrument. All of us in this room are the instruments for the future. We're the instruments that are going to help our organizations and communities figure out how to move forward. And so what the question is how do we tune the instrument? There are a few people here who I saw in the gym this morning. That's one way of thinking about tuning the instrument. I know in my stomach, right here, when it's an adaptive challenge. It's not an intellectual thing. I know it in my body. If I have a better breakfast, I know what the adaptive difficult work is better than if I ate a high corn syrup breakfast. So that's one idea. The second is, how do you find sanctuaries to reconnect to your purpose, to reconnect and revitalize what you're trying to do in the world? Our experiences in disequilibrium and crisis, the most likely thing you're going to do is what you've done before. And so the question is, how do you cultivate a relationship with purpose? So that's another anchor for you in that moment when you step into a difficult conversation. To not step into just what you've done before, but what can be possible to live out your purpose. And lastly, how do you find partners to debrief and understand this work is? How do you live with people who have an intimate understanding of what you're trying to do and where you're succeeding and failing? And so I just want to give those three ideas. First, how do we hold our own people and ourselves through an ongoing process of disequilibrium? How do we understand what's the essential and expendable, knowing that giving up that part of our identity is where the real work starts in some ways? And lastly, how do you tune your own instrument? So I just want to leave you with two ideas. The first is an image. Oops, not the book. But I like this image, right? So this is just the one idea here, is that the busiest room in Boston next year should be the gym. And what it would take for us all to tune our own instruments to be more ready for the work ahead of us. And then the other thing I would just say is that we're all at the frontier of this work. And we all are going to live at that frontier. And it's a wide frontier that we're pushing in all kinds of ways. And the opportunity here is to push it together. This is my first ILA conference, and I'm delighted to be welcomed into this community. And the question is, how are we going to push that frontier together? And so I just want to leave you with those two pieces, and thank you for the time.
Remarkably, they spent an hour and a half condensing this presentation for this time. Unfortunately, we do have times for questions and comments. If we don't have the mics walking around, stand up and shout, please. Please.
I'd like to ask a question about a real life example. Hello? Okay. The ILA listserv actually had a very interesting debate about how President Obama has handled the health care reform, and many people brought in your work around whether or not he gave the work back to the group and how he managed the environment. So I was wondering if you would respond in terms of your own ideas and thoughts about that.
I remain inspired that President Obama was elected president of the country, of our country, my country, and hopeful that he's going to learn quickly what he needs to learn to do it better. He has already done a lot of things terrifically well, beginning to repair relationships between the United States and the rest of the world, for example, setting the stage then for, but in terms of health care, let me see if I can. I think that's been treated, again, like a technical problem. Far too much. That the lessons they captured from President Clinton's mistakes were lessons in political tactics rather than lessons in public mobilization and public learning. And the irony, in a way, is that he ran a campaign that drew from the grassroots. However, mobilizing the grassroots for a binary choice, vote for me, vote for him, is much more straightforward than mobilizing the public to understand the complexity of health care when it affects a sixth of the nation's economy and 100% of the nation in regard to people getting sick, their parents, their children getting sick. So I would have much have preferred a 5 to 7 year time horizon in which there were multiple experiments being run. For example, one suggestion by one of my colleagues in medicine was, first fix Medicare. Medicare is already central, is the public option. But there are a lot of things about it that don't work. So fix that first. And there are about a dozen various kinds of experiments that could be run, and certainly the engagement of the public in much more sophisticated ways than simply the president having a town hall meeting or giving a speech in front of Congress. Because the kind of public learning required for people to get their heads around and their hearts around these changes is far more significant than just hearing it from on top. And unfortunately, if the public is unprepared, it's much more susceptible to manipulation and being terrorized and made fearful by very good Madison Avenue kinds of campaigns. And then the latitude for people in Congress to do things that are more interesting rather than things that are safe becomes much more constrained. So, I think it'll be great if something gets done simply because it buys time for him to do the next thing versus, really it would be a deep political wound if he got nothing done. But I think this had not been approached from the beginning as the adaptive process that it required.
Another question? Yes, and if those of you who have questions would stand up so we can identify you and have some chance to manage time, please. Yes.
I'm Karen Bradley. Not to nitpick, but why did you say adaptation is a metaphor as opposed to an action?
The word grows from, the word was first used in biologists' effort, Darwin's effort to understand the evolution of life, the history of life on our Earth. And the term adaptation was a way of trying to understand the processes that generate progress so that species can thrive in changing and challenging environments. And that's really how the term itself evolved in the intellectual history, the scientific history. Now, applying that scientific idea to cultural adaptation or political adaptation, social adaptation, I think we need to understand that it's a metaphor. And the reason why I think it's useful to see it as a metaphor is then we can go back to biology and say, well, these are interesting lessons. In biology, successful adaptations are highly conservative. In biology, they're a product of diversity and a high rate of mutation and experimentation, causing a lot of losses. in which, 30% of the time women get pregnant, they have a spontaneous miscarriage. It's a high failure rate because experiments fail when you've designed a system to innovate. Well, those are interesting ideas applied to biology. Do they apply to organizational political systems? We don't know. I mean, there's no direct correlation between insights from physics or insights from biology to the complexity of human behavior in social systems. We can use insights from science as a metaphor to get us thinking in more interesting ways, but then we've got to do the empirical work, we've got to observe closely, and that's what, so I think it is in truth a metaphor, and there is a lot of wisdom to be drawn from the origins of that word, but we have to think carefully about which ideas apply and which do not.
I'm seeing it in you as a behavior, and you're doing it right now, and I want to point out that it's really a choreography. Okay, it's something we do. We adapt. It's a verb. Okay, so just to bring it back to what we have to actually do.
I'm all for choreography and doing.
That got us through the C's and D's. There's a question about the E's. Choreography, doing, E. Any other questions? Yes.
The process of identifying essentials, and what I'm struggling with is how do you, I see as a consultant, I see in my practice a desire to privilege innovation and adaptive work over what's been before. So I'm curious about your thoughts about how do you also find ways to value and perhaps improve what has worked in the past. How do you decide when do you innovate as opposed to looking backwards and improving? And how does that search for the essentials play out in the real world, in real life?
We do have a question on an E, essentials. Andrew? Alexander?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing I would say is that it's an iterative process. One of the mistakes we made is when we think it's an expert process, that we're going to come in and identify what's essential. And so the question of trying to sort through and identify what is the history and looking past before you can move forward, I think is a critical piece of that. The second is trying to identify what's the loss that will be incurred by giving that up. We don't believe there are win-win situations in a way. The question is who's going to have to give up what to move forward? And that process of engaging the different stakeholders of what would have to be given up, and is that a casualty worth taking, is part of the iterative process. We've been doing a lot of work for a number of years with one of the largest food relief organizations. And we've been in a difficult conversation because they want to stop working on food relief to work on the roots of poverty, having spent millions and millions of dollars on that problem, and not seeing the communities they work in still being in really difficult conditions. Trying to understand what was essential has been a very difficult process. I don't want to minimize this work. They came into that work to do God's work, to be apolitical. And the question of would they be willing to give that up, to take a political side, has been a very difficult iterative process. It's taken 18 months with different stakeholders to begin to identify what it would be worth giving that up for. So I think the first instruction is it's a dialogic, iterative process. And the other question is, what are the casualties worth taking? For what purpose? Would be a way I begin to think about that.
Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time. I think the snippet of the presentation that you had, first of all, gives you incentive to go out and buy the book. But secondly, I think it reminds us of the important work that Ron has done and Ron is now doing in association with Alexander and Martin Lipsky in providing us a scaffolding for asking questions and also a framework with which to construct answers. So please join me in a round of applause and thank you. Now it is my pleasure to turn the next portion of the program over to Sandra Peart. Thank you. Who will make the presentation for the Javelin Dissertation Award. Sandra is the Dean of the Jepson School, Chair of the Leadership Program Directors, Deans, and Chairs in the ILA Affinity Group. And if I may, I did overlook in my haste to get this started, a thank you to Michael Jones and the music introduction that he provided us.
Alexander asked us to think about how each of us will prepare for the road ahead. I haven't been to the gym today, and I don't think I'm going to go, although maybe, but I doubt it. But we at the Jepson School of Leadership Studies have taken the position that one thing we might be able to do is to help identify and celebrate the research of the future leaders in the field of leadership studies. We have undertaken this task, and we're pleased to do so with the ILA. And as we do so, we celebrate then the scholarship of the person who has, in our view, written a dissertation which shows great promise in the field of leadership studies. The Javelin Dissertation Award is named for Frederick Javelin, Fred, the faculty member who was much beloved at the Jepson School until his untimely death in 2004. This year the award goes to Kathy Peltier. Kathy is at the College of Business and Public Administration at Cal State University in San Bernardino. I should note that she's a student of Jean Lipman-Blumen, and Ron Riggio was on her dissertation committee. Kathy gave a marvelous summary, and we had a lovely discussion of her dissertation in a session just before this one. And Al Goethals, who discussed the research, said that it was he said several times that it was a high-impact study. So I'm very pleased to announce that Kathy Peltier has been awarded the Javelin Dissertation Award for her dissertation, The Effects of Leader-Follower Relationships on Perceptions of and Reactions to Leader Toxicity. Kathy, please join me.
My name is Sarah Thompson, and I'm the chair of the Leadership Education MIG. And I'm here today to announce the winners of the Student Case Study Competition. This was the third annual case study competition, and it was sponsored by the Center for Leadership at Northwestern University, as well as Vodafone Czech Republic. During the past year, the case study competition was revised by a small group of volunteers within the Leadership Education MIG. I'd like to thank Jessica Briggs for her leadership in coordinating this effort, as well as Eric Kaufman, Natalie Kors, and Josh Tarr, who were also a part of this work. This year, there were 6 teams who competed in the case study competition, 3 undergraduate teams and 3 graduate teams. The students participated in 2 rounds of competition, beginning while they were in their home countries, reviewing the case and preparing a brief to be judged prior to the conference. Then the students participated in a poster session on Wednesday evening, thanks to those of you who attended. Throughout the conference, students engage in conversation and use information they learn by attending concurrent sessions as well as keynote presentations to shape their presentation. Last night, the students competed in the final round of the competition and presented their findings to a panel of judges. Before I announce the winners, I'd like to acknowledge our judges and those who helped and assisted with the case study competition. Natalie Kors, Jessica Briggs, Andrew Simon, Todd Murphy, Teresa Martinelli-Lee, Tina Dorfer, Karen Longman, Margie Nicholson, and Brent Gertson. Thank you to the judges and those who assisted. Please give me yeah. So now I'd like to announce the winners. It's my honor to present the undergraduate award to Kravis Leadership Institute. So when Miles Bird, Michelle Kim, Veronica Pugen, and Stephanie Smith come up. All right. Congratulations to the Kravis Leadership Institute. Secondly, I'd like to go ahead and present the graduate award to Eastern University. Would Eastern University please come forward? Jerry Remy, Stephanie Povatsky, and David Brewer. Just get $1,000.
Well, congratulations to all of our winners. Thank you very much, Sarah, for all of the work that you did on this, and everyone else, Northwestern, and all of our helpers. And I think in addition to those who won, if we could give a round of applause for every team, because this was phenomenal. Okay, folks, we are drawing very near to the close. Not quite yet, but fairly close. And this is the time when, as a tradition here at the ILA, that we weave our conference together. This is the time when we take to reflect on the experiences that we have had together, and also through words, how we then also weave together the themes and the experiences that we've had together. So to start us off on reflecting on this experience, Michael Jones, who we have all experienced his music, is now going to take time for us to deeply listen to his work, and also for us, as we deeply listen to his music, to think about what this experience has been to all of us. And then he will be followed by Mark Neppo from the Fetzer Institute, Catherine Tyler Scott from the ILA board, who will weave together through our words and their words the experiences of the last few days.
Thank you very much, Michael, for helping me to get a peaceful heart. Mark and I were very humbled by Cynthia's invitation to us to help weave together the experience of the last 4 or 5 days that we've been together. And we decided that the weaving of this conference was already going on inside of each of you and between you. And that what we needed to do was to just give you our reflections and to contribute to that weaving that not only started here but will continue on once we've left. So I, in the presence of Mark, the kind of person who kind of listens you into speech, journal some of my reflections, and I'm going to share those with you now. The work of transformation is adaptive work. It's the work of significant change and transition requiring what I think is bold action. It's bold action like described by Ivana and Monica as they shared their stories about the Velvet Revolution and the action of the students. Bold action, we learned, is not the fruit of fear or moral relativism, nor does it emanate from vengeance or a piety that can lead the oppressed to become the oppressor. Bold action comes from a deep place of knowing, a deep place of humanity, such as we observed in the opening plenary, the session that Tom, Juana, Prashad, and Eliane gave us. Or it can come from a gentle invitation, a calm voice, like that of Cynthia Cherry, who, if you remember, asked us a question in her opening remarks. How can we flip the leadership paradigm so that our work leads to innovative spirit and change-making? Well, that emboldened me. I suppose my friends know it doesn't take much, though. The boldness of which I speak has a thread of humility, tempered with the knowing that we are created for goodness, as Bishop Tutu said, a thread of integrity that is the plumb line for ensuring alignment between our values and our actions, our being and our doing. It is the answer, or at least one of the answers, posed by Parker's question. Was I fully present in the world with my own truth? And I think it is the example of Helga Huskova, the 80-year-old artist with a youthful and indomitable spirit. At the age of 12, when she and her parents were torn from the fabric of their very existence to begin what was a hellish journey of stays at concentration camps, Helga took with her a pad of paper, pencils, and crayons. Through her art, we see the triumph of the human spirit. And through unspeakable pain and deep sorrow, we see light and grace. Her storytelling through art says, life matters. You matter. I matter. And I felt this message on the walls of the Pinkas Synagogue, where the names of 80,000 Jewish Prague citizens are hand-inscribed. I felt silent, just as I did when I viewed the Jewish cemetery with layers and layers of lives lost. And I realized that I stand on ground of lives lost, stories lost, and that I am obligated to tell those stories because those stories are my story, and my story is their story. And those layers give me a height from which to see the world widely and differently, respectfully. My silence was deafening, and the silence, as Henry Nouwen says, teaches us to speak. And so as I emerged from the silence, I believed even more strongly that we all matter. You matter, I matter, our lives matter, and our stories matter. And they are a narrative of our lives and also trajectories of personal and professional transformation. And we have to be bold enough to tell our stories, because the reason for telling our stories is not simply to repeat the past, but to bring the past into the present for the sake of the future. In other words, as Shelley and many others reminded us in their remarks, our inner work is central to our outer work, to the bold action needed for true transformation. And I don't think it's any accident that we are here on the eve of the 20th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, because I think we've been issued an invitation to a revolution of our own. It is a revolution that honors the sense of place, the sacredness of space, the sharing of story, and the journey of shadow and light. And it is a revolution that calls for radical trust and truth-telling, grounded in history and in hope. And this revolution collects all of our passions, those that are already ablaze and those that need rekindling. It connects our memories, our relationships, our communities, our struggles, and our celebrations. And all of these things are elements of transformation. And in each of our processes of weaving together what this all means and why it matters, we will acquire the compassion, the fortitude, the courage, the perseverance, the patience, and love, yes, love, necessary to change what only we can change. So this conference to me has been an invitation to all of us to this revolution, not only for our own development, but for the sake of the world. And each of us is called to RSVP. But in doing so, we have to remember that transformations may not occur in this conference, in one day, in 1 year, and perhaps not even in our lifetime. So I would like to end my remarks with the words of Reinhold Niebuhr as we move forward into continuing to weave what this all means and why it matters. Nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime, and therefore we must be saved by hope. And nothing which is true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history, and therefore we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone, and therefore we must be saved by love. Please RSVP to the revolution. Thank you.
Catherine said, I know can you hear me? Yeah, okay, I just can't hear myself. Catherine said, do you want me to stay up here? I said, yes, don't leave me up here. I want to also echo what Catherine said, that it is impossible to summarize the experiences, and really to echo the invitation that on your way, wherever you're going from here, to tell a story, even to the stranger on the plane who can't get out from behind you or beside you. I'd like to offer a few thoughts about how I've been impacted by you and by this city. So I'd like to share some personal reflections and then try to tie them to what this has all felt like. I think that being here at this time, what this organization and this community is about, that we have reinvigorated and reaffirmed something that we've known forever, and that is each person can make a difference. And the deeper question is, will we inhabit our own truth and heart enough to know what that difference is and to step into it? So I've heard a lot of different things about living in truth, knowing who we are, what we are, where we come from. So let me reflect on that personally for a moment. I had no idea. I was part of offering a set of workshops here. One was on the search for belonging through story, and I had no idea that I would fall into my own deeper sense of belonging. I'm 58 years old. I'm Jewish. My grandparents' family died in different camps. I never met them. I've seen pictures. So, of course, I have been spending a lot of time in a lot of places here, particularly the Jewish cemetery. And I realized in such company, living and dead, felt here for the first time how much being an American Jew living in the Midwest, 2 generations and a continent away, how much of an invisible minority I am a part of. And I also heard someone in one of our workshops say during these last few days, I'm only a minority here, wherever here is, but not where I came from. And felt a sense of understanding for the first time. I felt connection to the fact that somehow, and I wasn't consciously taught this, but that reverberating from the Holocaust across generations and oceans was the untaught lesson that it's dangerous to be visible. If you are visible, you might perish. So with that awareness, I already feel more visible. And realize that, and this is where it starts to get not just for me in my own significance, but in some meaning we all share, is that, which has been echoed so courageously by the anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, by so many things that echo the civil rights movement in America, that each moment is a time to decide whether we will say who we are and be who we are or not. And that so much comes down to that. So I think, two questions that have stayed with me from other travels. One is from a civil rights historian and participant in the civil rights, Vincent Harding, who lives in Denver, who asked, I heard him ask once several years ago now, but it stayed with me, how do we prepare ourselves inwardly to participate in the oneness of humanity? I keep living with that question, and a forgiveness researcher, Robert Enright, has asked, how do we prepare the hearts of the children for the conflicts they will inherit? I think that our time here, and last year in ILA and next year in Boston, and it has something to do with those questions. And I think that what I've heard and felt is the fact that this all has to do with more than one person, more than one capacity, more than one organization, more than one way of thinking, more than one tradition. So I leave here not the same as when I came. And I would like to close this on behalf of Catherine and I with a poem from Václav Havel. Did I say that right? Yeah, that's practice. Yeah. That is called Beginning to Be. Once I begin, once I try here and now, right where I am, not excusing myself by saying that things would be easier elsewhere, without grand speeches and ostentatious gestures, but all the more persistently to live in harmony with the voice of being as I understand it within myself. As soon as I begin that, I suddenly discovered to my surprise that I am neither the only one, nor the first, nor the most important one to have set out upon that road. Whether all is really lost or not depends entirely on whether or not I am lost. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Michael and Mark and Catherine, for giving us the space to reflect on this experience and sharing your personal thoughts with all of us. They really were from the heart. Michael, thank you for the music that shares so much in terms of yourself and the giving of yourself to the ILA every year in doing this. So thank you very much for sharing your space. Let me thank all of you. We talk about individual thanks, and I'll get to them. But let me thank each and every one of you here for participating in this conference, for giving of yourself, your time, if it was presenting, if it was the conversations in the hallway, if it was the late night, if it was having coffee together or breakfast together or sharing your thoughts and challenging each other, being here and being with us and being in the present. Thank all of you for giving of your time and your effort. And remember the thing that we talked about at the very beginning, and that is that comfortable indifference is not for any of us. That we each have a responsibility to ourselves and to each other to take our messages forward in terms of on behalf of yourself and on behalf of the International Leadership Association. But I would be remiss if I didn't thank some individuals and some groups. First and foremost, our student volunteers. Heather McDougall and the 14 students, if you could please stand from the Global Initiative for Leadership and Civic Development. For my personal tour guides and shoppers in that group, you know who you are. Thank you very much. And also from Pulaski University, if you could please stand. We had 40 students from Pulaski University as well who were here, and I don't know if they're still here, but I wanted to thank them as well because they were spectacular. If the chairs and chair-elects of the member interest groups could please stand. Stay standing, stay standing. These individuals, as you leave today, I want you to also personally thank them because this is the foundation where our member involvement gets involved. And through each and every one of them, if it is through scholarship, education, business, public leadership, or leadership development, they have reviewed hundreds and hundreds of proposals that came forward to select those that were presented here today. So if your session was selected, you may thank them. And if it wasn't, you may also find them. No, I won't do that to you guys. But not only that, but they are the heart of this association. And for all of you, please get involved in your member interest groups as well. So thank you very, very much. They created the program, and it is the ILA staff that brings that to reality. So if the International Leadership Association staff could all please stand. I know some of them are in the back, some are still out there, but if you could all stand. Josh, all of you.
and for those folks who allowed us to profoundly experience this wonderful city and this great country. If our European committee members and our local Prague committee members and Renata could please stand so that we could thank all of you overall. And of course, Ivana, our conference chair, for all of the good work that you did in convincing us how special and how important it was for us to be here, and all of your good hard work. If you could please come forward to this standing ovation and officially close out the conference. Thank you. And now it will be very difficult for me to speak, so we might be here forever. Well, I welcomed you 3 days ago, and now we are in final moments of the conference. I'd like to thank not only people who joined their efforts to organize this conference, but also to you, the participants, because without you and your participation, your wonderful joint experience, it would not be the same conference. So thank you, all of you. As we close this conference, the celebration of the 20th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution has begun in the Czech Republic. So I officially close this conference and invite all of you in our celebration of the Velvet Revolution, which has just begun. I look forward to seeing you at the ILA's 12th annual conference in Boston in October 2010.